We are joined by Donald Rothwell, Professor of International Law at the Australian National University. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. So as you heard, given ongoing missile, drone, and naval engagements in the Strait of Hormuz, does the ceasefire still hold, or is it no longer meaningful?
Look, I've taken the view that since the United States imposed the blockade 2 weeks ago, that the ceasefire was no longer in effect. But I think if we need any confirmation of that, the events overnight have really just clarified that in terms of there being an exchange of fire. The United States reports in terms of Iranian fast boats having been targeted and sunk, and Iranian retaliation. So whilst hostilities haven't resumed to the full extent that we saw a few weeks ago, there's clearly lots of evidence of hostilities taking place between the two belligerents.
Indeed, a very volatile situation. And I wonder, how close are we, do you think, now to full-scale conflict and others being drawn in? And what are the key tripwires that worry you the most?
Well, I think the greatest concern at the moment is that the diplomatic process, the peace talks that were being held in Pakistan really seem to have come to an end. There doesn't seem to be much momentum behind that at the moment, notwithstanding the efforts of the Pakistani mediators and others who've been involved. And we know that President Trump last week decided that he wouldn't send a US delegation to Pakistan to continue those talks. So diplomatically at the moment, we really seem to see matters at a stalemate. On the US side, though, we've seen the United States announce recently this Project Freedom Initiative, which was really a military initiative to reopen the straits. And so that in itself is a new military initiative in terms of the conflict. And so I think we're really moving from a grey zone that we've had over the last few weeks, where there's been a tenuous ceasefire, to perhaps a full resumption of hostilities. And obviously, if the United States seeks to commence military operations to move shipping out of the strait, we'd have to expect some Iranian response.
Okay, Professor, Iran says that its attack on the UAE's Fujairah port was not premeditated and it resulted instead from the U.S.'s military adventurism, while the U.S. says that its attacks on Iranian boats were to protect commercial shipping. What do you make of their claims? And under UNCLOS, how is the Strait of Hormuz's transit passage classified, and does the Project Freedom fall within these legal rights?
Look, I think the great difficulty we face here is the sort of ongoing claims and counterclaims, don't we, in terms of both sides with respect to what is actually occurring. Some of these reports have been verified. Others are really just allegations. So I think we will continue to see that for some period of time. But in terms of the critical question, in terms of the status of the Strait of Hormuz, the status of the Strait of Hormuz is not really contested in international law. And interestingly, it wasn't really contested by the Iranians prior to the commencement of the conflict at the end of February. And that is that the transit passage regime, which allows for the free and unhindered navigation of all vessels through the strait, should be retained. But we need to acknowledge that even though we are in this sort of twilight zone at the moment, we are still in the middle of an armed conflict of whatever classification we might want to bring to bear about it. And that really sees the effective suspension of many of the rights of the freedom of navigation as recognised under the law of the sea. And indeed, even for vessels that were transiting the strait at the moment, and of course vessels that have sought to transit the strait over the last few weeks, there are significant safety and security issues associated with that. So we really will not, I think, in my view, see a true return to normalcy in terms of the application of the law of the sea and the acceptance of the transit passage regime until we see a full cessation of hostilities.
And speaking of normalcy, Professor, you've recently written about possible pathways to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. At this point, which scenario looks most realistic, and how feasible is it under current conditions?
So at the moment, we seem to have two concrete proposals on the table, and the first is the one that the French and the United Kingdom have sought to develop through a coalition of countries, and they've been engaged in discussions about that proposal for the course of many weeks now, in which they've had buy-in from a number of European states and also from a number of Asian states, and that seems to be relatively well supported. But that's all contingent on the cessation of hostilities and really there being a peace settlement. We now have this counter proposal that the United States is seeking to advance through Project Freedom, which seems to be solely a US initiative with some support perhaps from other Gulf states. But that's really an initiative that the United States seems to be pushing forward whilst we have this ongoing dispute between the United States and Iran. So those are the two options on the table. My own view is it's the coalition proposal that the French and the United Kingdom are seeking to advance, but that will only come into play once we see a full peace settlement.
Yeah, and Professor, Treasury Scott Bessent has called on China and allies to join this U.S.-led operation to escort ships through the strait, especially in China, which he says purchases 90% of Iran's energy. Now, does Beijing's purchase of Iran's energy legally constitute what he says is funding the largest state sponsor of terrorism?
Well, look, ultimately, this goes to the concerns that the United States has in terms of kickstarting the Iranian economy again and ultimately channeling money into the IRGC. And this, at the end of the day, is the root of one of the concerns that the United States and indeed many Western and other Asian countries have had about the Iranian regime in itself. So at one level, you can't have it both ways. If you're wanting to reopen the strait, and reopen the flow of oil out of the region, that will also inevitably see some flow of oil perhaps coming out of Iran. So there's going to be some economic benefit to Iran at the end of the day. But one of the critical issues, of course, that I've discussed and others have discussed is this ongoing Iranian proposal to possibly impose tolls on the strait once there is a full resumption of trade. And of course, that would be of great economic benefit to the Iranians. And I think that that's something that many countries around the world, and including the United States now, very much want to avoid in terms of any ongoing scenario for a post-war freedom of navigation through the strait.
All right. And just a final question, Professor. You know, the threats back and forth, no breakthrough in ceasefire talks, peace talks, ceasefire threatened. What is your assessment on what we could see in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think really much depends on whether or not the United States is really going to move forward with this Project Freedom proposal. We know that the US military has significantly advanced and increased its military presence within the region. It was only a few weeks ago that there was a lot of speculation about a possible US land operation within the Strait of Hormuz. They certainly have reportedly over 15,000 US service members in the region. So they certainly have that capability of being able to commence a land campaign. If they were to take that option, that would really see a significant escalation of the dispute. And many countries around the world, including in the West and in most parts of Asia, really want to avoid that. So I think we're really at an interesting balancing point between the military option that the Trump administration is seeking to pursue and consider, as opposed to going down the path of diplomacy and trying to bring about some resolution of this dispute.
All right. We thank you for joining us today. Professor, that was Donald Rothwell. He's Professor of International Law at the Australian National University.